Kurt Bradley, and this is The Gentleman's Flavor. In today's video, we're going to talk about what is probably the most masculine spirit of all types of alcohol. It's an elixir with a distinctive brown color that has been sung about countless times in both country music and rock and roll. One that was routinely smuggled into the United States from Canada during the time of Prohibition, and has also fueled many a barroom brawl. It's also one of the biggest exports ever to come out of the land of Scotland. You guessed it, my friend, whiskey. Our video today is going to give you a clear and definitive explanation about what separates one type of whiskey from the next. If you've come looking for answers about whiskey, you've come to the right place. In front of me, I have 6 different types of whiskey, all hailing from different parts of the world. Well, except for these 2. I've got bourbon, I've got rye whiskey, Canadian, Irish whiskey, blended whiskey from Scotland, and the granddaddy of them all, single malt Scotch whiskey. Among these whiskeys, it's the Irish, rye, and bourbon that typically use an E in the spelling of the word whiskey. All Scottish varieties, as well as Canadian and Japanese, not pictured here, traditionally choose to omit the E from the spelling of whiskey in their branding. At its most basic definition, whiskey is a distilled alcohol made from fermented grain, mash, which can include barley, rye, wheat, or corn, before it's completed by being aged in wooden casks, generally made of charred oak. Among these varieties, there are numerous subtle, but sometimes not so subtle differences that separate one type of whiskey from the next. First, let's start with single malt Scotch whiskey. First prerequisite, must be made in Scotland. That's where this stuff comes from originally. It must be made in Scotland, otherwise you can call it a single malt, but you can't call it Scotch. Trust me, there's laws and even Scottish superstitions that govern this stuff. Other single malt producing countries include Japan, Canada, Australia, Norway, even India, to mention a few. This is a Macallan 12-year single malt. It's a beautiful Scotch. It's the Scotch that James Bond drank. To be a single malt Scotch, a whiskey must be distilled at a single distillery using a pot still, which is usually copper, and be made from a mash of only malted barley, hence the name malt, before being aged in oak casks for a minimum of 3 years and 1 day. Trust me, most are aged longer. Single malt Scotch is the creme de la creme of the whiskey world, and typically, as a result, comes with the higher sticker price. Boom, also Scotch, alternatively, a blended Scotch, like the famous Grouse here, contains a blend of different single malt whiskies, sometimes coming from the same distillery, sometimes coming from multiple distilleries. Thus, these 2 can both be called Scotch, the only 2 in the world that can be referred to as such, and of course they have no E in their spelling. Okay, let's travel to Ireland. Irish whiskey. Of course, Irish whiskey must be made in the Emerald Isle, like this Jameson here, which is now distilled in the city of Cork, not Dublin. To differentiate themselves from Scotch, peat is seldom used in Irish whiskies, often resulting in a less smoky, somewhat smoother finish. Like Scotch, Irish whiskey must be matured for a 3-year minimum and can be made as a single malt. However, the other type of Irish whiskey is called single pot still, which, unlike Scotch, is made from both malted and raw unmalted barley. This Jameson is a blend made from grain whiskey combined with single pot still whiskey. Oh, Canada! Canadian whiskey is blended with multiple grains like corn, barley, and rye, with corn making the highest percentage. Of course, it must be made in Canada. It also must be aged for a minimum of 3 years, paying homage to Canada's Commonwealth with the United Kingdom. And it must contain an alcohol percentage no less than 40%. Unlike other countries, Canadian whiskey can also add a small amount of caramel or flavoring in their whiskey, making one Canadian whiskey sometimes vary quite considerably from the next. For this reason, most of the spiced whiskeys that you find out there, which are quite sweet, hail from Canada. Rye whiskey has seen a huge comeback, a big surge as of lately, thanks in part to hipster culture, which made it cool again. Prior to that, only your cankerous old grandfather drank this stuff. Rye is super cool again. Rye whiskey must be made of a mash of at least 51% rye, with corn and barley usually making up the rest, before it ends up being aged in charred oak barrels for at least 2 years. After that, it's referred to as straight rye whiskey. Rye whiskeys are often usually American or Canadian in origin. Bourbon, baby! Let's head to the south. Bourbon is distilled from 51% corn and results in a taste that is slightly sweeter finish than the rye as a result of the higher percentage of the sweeter corn used. The remainder is usually made from a wheat grain cereal. Like everything else, it's barrel aged, being aged in charred American barrels, but only for a minimum of 2 years. Although bourbon can be distilled anywhere in the US, its strongest association is in the South, most notably in Kentucky. Missing here is Tennessee whiskey, which usually, but not always, is distilled under almost the same circumstances as bourbon. Only in Tennessee, they choose not to call it a bourbon like they do in Kentucky to differentiate themselves. Before me, we've assembled basically the biggest types of whiskey that you can find throughout the world. Hey, things get even more specific with different flavors and different colors and different single malts coming from strange parts of the world. But when you get right down to it, if you're going to put something in your bar, these 6 are probably where you want to start off. These are all great sippers. They can also all be enjoyed on ice. Some can be mixed as a cocktail or maybe with Coke if you'd like. I certainly wouldn't be mixing this, I'll tell you that much. Hey, whiskey's one of my favorite drinks, and if you're watching, I know it probably is yours too. You may or may not know, but I'm a big fan of enjoying cigars with spirits, and if there's a spirit that pairs with a cigar probably better than anything else, it's whiskey. Hey, I want to thank you for watching today. We love putting these videos together for you. If you don't mind, we'd love if you hit that subscribe button and maybe hit like as well. We're going to keep making wonderful videos for you. After watching this video, you may feel inclined to pour yourself a glass of something, or maybe a wee dram. As always, thanks for watching. I'm Kurt Bradley, and this is The Gentleman's Flavor. Cheers.